I'm Ken Rockwell. Let's take a look at Canon's new RF 100 to 500 millimeter ultra telephoto general purpose zoom for the full frame EOS R series of camera. First, let's take a look at some of the pictures I can make with this great lens. This obviously is a macro shot. What a lot of people won't realize is this lens has fantastic macro abilities. It gets super close, even closer than this, which replaces for many people a need for a macro lens. It also makes the lens incredibly useful for everything because it focuses super close. It focuses as close as about 3 feet, depending on your focal length. So you don't have to worry about it being an ultra-tel lens like Nikon's 200 to 500 that can't focus closer than about 8 feet. This lens, the 100 to 500, replaces all of the 70 to 200 lenses I used to use. Of course, everything is sharp and beautiful. Here's a fountain. This is shot on my EOS R6, and this is shot in the square crop mode. Of course, here in television where we're running 16:9, it doesn't fit, but you see I can zoom in and it looks wonderful in the last light. This shot here is at 167 millimeters wide open at f5, handheld at 1/250th at auto ISO 100 with minus 1/3 of a stop exposure compensation. And this is exactly as it came out of the camera. Here's another shot, again on the EOS R6, which is the low resolution camera. That's only 20 megapixels and it still looks fantastic here on television. This also in the square crop mode. This is at 145 millimeters at f7.1, handheld at a 400th at ISO 100 with minus 1/3 of a stop exposure compensation. And the lens is super sharp, but all lenses have been super sharp. Here's the end of days, photographed at 135 millimeters on the EOS R5 in its square crop mode. 135 millimeters at f6.3, handheld at a 3/20th at auto ISO 100 with minus 1 stop exposure compensation to keep the sky looking real dark and not to lose the saturation in the evil red sun, which otherwise probably would have washed out to look yellow or something, which didn't look like it looked to my eye at the time. Here's a shot of some palms. Again, with the low resolution EOS R6, it still looks super sharp. This is at 223 millimeters at f7.1, handheld at 1/500th of a second at auto ISO 100 with minus 7/10 of a stop exposure compensation. Looks pretty sharp to me. So there's not much else to say. To be honest, I'm going to say a lot and get into explicit details in this lens, but it's sharp, it's well made, it is quality made in Japan, where Canon is based. It's not offshore to China or some other communist or other country outside of where the company's actually based. I really appreciate that. Canon cares about making a quality product. They're not just trying to make it as cheaply as they can just to get it out of the way. Super close focusing, as I've already shown, focuses to 3 feet at 100 millimeters or only 4 feet at 500 millimeters. So you can get super close with this lens and you'll almost never have a problem where your subject is getting too close for you to focus. That makes this lens extremely useful. Most other lenses that go to 500 millimeters don't focus anywhere near this close. And that is one of the things that really lets me love this lens. And it does everything for me as a telephoto. So I don't need the old 70 to 200 millimeter range anymore, which honestly I think is more of a film relic. We don't need f2.8, not on digital. Why? Because on film I'm shooting ISO 50 Velvia. I need f2.8. With digital, or even ISO 400 or 800 looks fantastic, I don't need f2.8. You're better off if you're going to shoot teleconverters using the older EF 100 to 400 millimeter lens, and I have a comparison to the EF 100 to 400 millimeter LIS2 as a separate video. The problem is if this lens is zoomed to less than 300 millimeters, there is an interference in the back of the lens because the glass gets too close to the mount and it won't even let you mount the teleconverter. So to be honest, with teleconverters, you only have the small range between 300 and 500, so that's not a big sale. I would say skip the teleconverters. If you're going to use teleconverters, get a different lens. What's also nice is it includes the hood, and this is a nice hood with a lock and a little window that you can use to get to your rotating polarizer or grads. It has a nice case. This is a nice padded case. Also, it's got the best tripod collar I've seen. What's nice is you'll notice I don't even use the tripod collar. When you take the collar off, it's really nice. It's not like the 100 to 400 lens. Again, I'll have a separate video. This collar never came off of this lens, and you can take the foot off, but not the whole collar, so it's a bit clunky. This lens, it's nice and smooth, like a baby dolphin when you want to shoot it without the collar. And to get the collar on, you can unlatch it like that, and you see how it pops on? It pops on real nice. Although it does not have click stocks at 90 degrees, it does have a friction lock, and a nice thing is when you're sitting on a tripod, to grab this whole assembly. You just pull that, to unlatch it, poop, now you're off your tripod. Honestly, I leave this in my bag. I don't usually use it, but if I am using a camera on a tripod, you should use it because this is a little bit more lens than I want to have pulling my tripod down when I'm shooting with my camera on a tripod. It's nice. It has a reasonable 77mm front filter. It's only a plastic ring. That's too bad, but it's a nice rational 77mm ring. You can adjust the drag of the zoom ring. I normally leave it, they call smooth. That means loose. That's good. If you're for some reason shooting on a tripod and this lens is now 10 years old and it's getting a little droopy, this lens has no droop or no creep. You can set it, and you can vary this any place you want to. You can set it to tight, which isn't tight. It's just stiffer. It's really a stiffness adjuster, but I guess that's when you make the lens in Japan and need to put language that, admittedly, this ships all over the world with this English lettering on here. You want to make sure that it's understandable by everybody, and I guess that's what they chose to use. You'll notice you can see how it works. See how it tightens up just a little bit? But this is nice. And so you have your choice of how stiff is the zoom ring. If you're in the United States, another nice thing is you've got great technical support. 1-800-OK-Canon gets me the answers I need from talented people who know photography and know their product, and so it's easy to get whatever advice I might happen to need about any of my Canon products. There's nothing bad about this lens. The only thing bad is that it's not free. It's relatively expensive, but to be honest, lenses are your best investments because this lens is going to last you, at least my other lenses. I've got 10, 20, 30-year-old Canon lenses. They work just great. It's a long-term investment. Money spent on a camera. I know everybody's all excited about the EOS R5 today, and I sure am. The thing is, today they're selling used for $5,000 in September of 2020 as I make this video. You know, give it 2 more years, give it 5 more years, not going to be $5,000 anymore. This lens will not change that much in price. I paid $2,200 for my full price, $100 to $400, back in must have been 2014. That's still what it sells for to this day. There's nothing missing major on this lens. The only 2 things missing is typical for the Canon EOS R system. You don't always have full-time manual focus override. If you look at my user's guides at kenrockwell.com to the various cameras, you have to set in your camera a lens electronic AF option, and you have to set it to either one-shot enabled or one-shot enabled magnify. And again, the instructions for that are on my website. If you do that, then only in one-shot mode, once you lock focus, then when you turn this focus ring, you will get into manual focus just by turning the ring, but that's not the default. And I know it took me quite a while to figure out how to do that. And the only other thing missing is, again, on the tele-extenders, you can't go between 300 to 100, which is a real bummer because this is a very narrow range to use when you're using it on an extender. If we look at the specifics of performance, overall, as I said, it's ultra sharp, it focuses fast, it focuses super close. There's no complaints or concerns about that. Manual focus is entirely electronic. This ring is not connected to anything except an electronic encoder, which then talks to the computers in your camera, which in turn drive the motors of the lens to focus it. Focus breathing for cinematographers. That's the image changing size as it's focused from near to far. At 100 and 200 millimeter range, the image gets a little bit smaller as focused more closely. And surprisingly, at 500 millimeters, I don't see any breathing. The image does not change size as you focus near or far. Bokeh is neutral to good. Here are photos from headshot distance, and these are all wide open. This is at 100 millimeters. And you see the little circles in the background, which are actually little flowers. There's nothing unusual. They're just circles. At 200 millimeters, they're simply bigger circles. Now, of course, I stood further back to keep the size of my subject about the same here, but it's neutral. At 500 millimeters, same thing. And the beauty of it is, I know many consumers might be freaked out that this lens is only f7.1. That's a lot. You'll notice there's a lot of glass here in the front because you've got a 500 millimeter lens at f7.1. Bokeh is more affected by the focal length than by the f number, and as you can see, the background pretty well goes away at 500 millimeters. And again, if you want to throw the background as far out of focus as you can, get as close as you can, shoot at 500 millimeters in f7.1, and that's what you've got. Distortion performance is excellent. At the 100 millimeter range, there is no visible distortion, and as you zoom towards 500 millimeters, you can get just a moderate to minor amount of pincushion distortion. It's nothing you're going to see in regular photography. And if you want to do some scientific photography, just turn on your camera's automatic correction, and it completely goes away. Ergonomically, it handles great. Most of it is just this big fat zoom ring, and you've got a manual focus ring, which is in a good spot. My thumb just naturally goes here, and all the camera lenses from Canon pretty much put things in the same place. You've got your auto manual focus switch goes here. This modification is further up, so you have to reach further up to get the focus range limiter, and I'll cover that towards the end of the video, how to use all this stuff. And the stabilizer is in the same place as all of Canon's other lenses, which is good. And we've got 3 stabilizer modes to be covered later on in the video. The only concern I would have is, the good news is you've got an extra free no charge control ring. This is actually another control ring, which you can program to be aperture or exposure compensation or ISO or a lot of other things depending on your camera. The honest thing is, when actually shooting, if you're shooting this, okay, we're zooming it, and then we're doing this, you have to reach way back to get this, so it's a little bit less convenient, but I don't know where else they would put that. So it's a freebie. If you don't like that, don't use it. Light fall off is completely invisible at the default settings on all your cameras, which automatically correct it. It's called peripheral illumination correction. If you are silly enough to go turn off the automatic correction and then go looking for it, which is much like banging your head against the wall and complaining that it hurts, yes, at maximum aperture, there's a little bit. Now, this is greatly exaggerated here because it's just a gray field. If you have an actual subject and an actual photograph, it usually looks good because it's essentially lightening up your primary image in the middle of the frame and leading your eyes away from the corners. So this fall off is oftentimes a good thing. But you'll see a little bit here. This is at 100 millimeters, and actually it looks the same at all the focal lengths at the maximum aperture. Using this with filters, I could stack at least 3 regular 77 millimeter filters and not get any vignetting on full frame at any focal length setting, and I probably could stack more filters. I just didn't have any more when I tested it, so that's great. If you want to use well, you never would use a polarizer in a grad, because if you actually photograph in reality, you realize that the directions in which you'd point the lens for use with a neutral density grad, which is usually into the sunset or sunrise, is not where polarization takes effect. But the point was, you can put all the filters you want in this lens, although with digital, we don't use a lot of filters anymore. Lateral color fringes. Excellent. Normally the camera's correct for this automatically, and even if you go out of your way to turn off the automatic correction and then go looking for it, there's just a tiny bit of green magenta lateral fringing at 100 millimeters, none in the middle of the zoom range, and just the slightest bit of the opposite magenta green lateral fringing at 500 millimeters. It is so small, you'd never even see it. Macro performance is fantastic. This is the full frame image, and I'm zooming in here using the editing abilities of my computer on the still image. I'm not zooming the lens here. I'm actually just zooming the image after the fact so you can look for sharpness. It is super sharp. This is at 500 millimeters, wide open at f7.1, and at 640th of a second at auto IS 100, exactly as I shot it. And if I zoom in here, this is ultra, ultra, ultra sharp. If you're shooting macro, you don't want to shoot this at the 100 millimeter setting. You want to shoot it at the 500 millimeter setting and stand as far away as you can. Why? Simple. When you shoot macro from like half a foot away, you get a really weird perspective because most people don't look to things at half a foot away. We normally perceive things as how they look from about 5, 10, 15 feet away. For macro, set this to 500 and stand at whatever distance you need to get the magnification you need. You'll get a much more natural 3-dimensional rendering of your subject. This lens stops down to f32 at 100 millimeters, and it stops down to all the way to f51 at the 500 millimeter range. Mechanically, it's a very well-made lens. I mean, gosh, it is. It's a $2,500, $2,700 lens made in Japan. It is all plastic on the outside, but the good news is it is mostly metal on the inside. There's no rubber bumper on the front of this lens, but there is a rubber bumper on the hood. Sadly, the filter threads are plastic. The hood bayonet mount, this front barrel is plastic. The zoom ring is rubber-covered plastic. This smooth tight ring is plastic. This section here is all plastic. The focus ring is rubber-covered plastic. The rear barrel is plastic. This control ring is plastic. But here's the deal. If you want all metal, opt for the 100 to 400 EF lens. But here's the problem. The good news is it costs less, and the good news is it's all metal, but the bad news is that it weighs more, and you probably don't want to carry more. The serial number on this lens, as you probably have seen, is laser engraved on the bottom of the barrel. I couldn't find a date code on it. What noises does it make when shaking around? The most noise it makes is from the IS system inside. Doesn't cage or doesn't lock down when the lens is off, so it will rattle a little bit. For sharpness, this is ultra, ultra sharp, even wide open at 45 megapixels in the corner. This is at 100 millimeters, wide open at f4.5 at a thousandth of a second on the EOS R5. And I'm zooming in, and I'm going to zoom in on the corner here. This is at 110 degrees or 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. So you've got heat shimmer, and this lens still looks good. Here at 200 millimeters, wide open at f5, again, sharp edge to edge, and I'm zooming in here to the corner. It's sharp. So in other words, if you can't make a sharp picture with this lens, you're doing something wrong. You want to shoot at ISO 100 for your camera to be its sharpest, and then at that, you want to make sure that all of your subject is in focus. If you have things at different distances, then only one thing is going to be in focus, the rest will be out of focus. You want to shoot wide open. If you shoot stop down to say f22, f32, diffraction is going to dull your results. And you want to make sure you don't have any motion of the subject or of the camera or any heat shimmer, which really can make a mess out of things in a lot of photographs shot long distance. I'm surprised that I got results this good on a day this hot. I guess everything was just so hot there wasn't much differential in the temperature, so it was good. Here's at 500 millimeters, wide open at f7.1. Ultra sharp. Things never used to be this sharp. That's what makes this lens so impressive. I've been shooting for a long time, and I've seen lenses a lot less sharp than this, so I am really impressed. Most importantly, if you got an older camera, make sure to update your firmware to at least 1.1.1 for the EOS R5 and R6. If you don't, the image stabilization does not work well, and you will get soft and fuzzy images. But at least as of the middle of September 2020, update to at least version 1.1.1 in the R5 and R6, and it will look awesome. Spherochromatism is an artifact where out-of-focus highlights may take on colored fringes. There is not any significant spherochromatism. I show my wristwatch here, and you'll notice that the foreground and background that are out of focus really don't take on any color fringes. But that's as I expect because this lens is so slow. Spherochromatism affects normally lenses that are very fast and normal to moderately long focal lengths. Image stabilization works great. On the EOS RP, I can hold it most of the time with perfect tripod equivalent sharpness down at 1/8 of a second at 100 millimeters. At 200 millimeters on an unstabilized EOS RP, most of the time I'm getting perfect tripod equivalent sharpness most of the time at 1/8 to a 15th of a second, and even at 500 millimeters most of the time at a 30th of a second, perfect tripod equivalent sharpness. If I go to the EOS R5 with firmware version 1.1.1, I get about the same results. I get most of the time perfectly sharp shots at 1/8 of a second at 100 millimeters, 15th of a second at 200, and about a 60th of a second at 500 millimeters. So it didn't make that much of an improvement. On the EOS R6, which again has a little bit lower resolution, so I won't see any motion blur as well, I get down to about 1/4 of a second at 100 millimeters, about 1/8 of a second or a 30th or a 15th or so at 200 millimeters on the R6, and down to about a 30th at 500 millimeters on the R6. So again, with version 1.1.1 firmware, I don't see much of an improvement in stabilization with the in-camera stabilization added on the R5 and R6. Sunstars, I get sunstars only on the smallest apertures. Here you go. I will go up an aperture here. You can also see what little there is in the way of flare, which is relatively insignificant. At the smaller aperture, some of the weird rainbow effects are actually artifacts of the sensor, because I'm doing something stupid here. I'm exposing for the bottom of a palm tree that's in shadow and letting the sun shine directly into the camera, which is just not good for the camera. But I'm not getting a whole lot in the way of sunstars. Here's a quick user's guide. It's real simple. As I covered, this smooth or tight means tight or loose for the zoom ring. It's how stiff it is when you turn it. These switches, this is a focus limiter. Always leave it in full. If for some reason your lens is focusing and getting distracted by something that's too close and it's taking too long to focus, then you can put it in this 3 meter to infinity, which won't let it focus any closer than 3 meters or 10 feet. But leave it in full. Because if you put it here or knock it here by accident, you'll be trying to take a close-up and cursing yourself because the camera won't focus. That's what that switch does. Autofocus, manual focus, it's as simple as what it says. Autofocus lets autofocus work, and if you set your camera right, you can use manual focus as well with this ring. Manual focus disables autofocus, and manual focus always is active. The stabilizer on or off, always leave it on unless you're on an extremely sturdy tripod and or with exposures longer than about 1 second, just leave it on. So in other words, even if I'm on a tripod at shorter speeds, I'll still leave the stabilizer on because our tripods are not solid granite. Stabilizer modes are simple. Leave it on mode 1. Mode 2 is for panning for sports or action. Mode 3 is the same as Mode 1, but Mode 3 only stabilizes the moment you take the image. It doesn't stabilize the image in the viewfinder, so it saves a little on battery power. And that's it. Thanks for watching Ken Rockwell, and it's kenrockwell.com here on kenrockwell.tv.